poems, he doesn't write so much about social realists, doesn't have social realist heroes. He has these counter heroes. So he has one poem, for example, that said in Tagalog, it says, I did not memorize any of these poems, but I don't want to be intelligent, because if you're intelligent, you don't succeed. It's better if I just, this becomes stupid, and that way I'll become successful. Right? This is kind of the tenor of his poems. He's very ironic. He's very, what do you call this? He's sarcastic, right? But he also has these poems that that are always about what I call adventurism. Now, politically, adventurism is a bad thing. Adventurism means in political movements that you try to seize power at an inopportune moment, that you overestimate your forces, that you, these are the ways that adventurism is thought of. But when I look at the Lacapa's poems, I see something else going on there. I see that some of these ways, modes of experience that are attributed to the poor, which politically were seen as, as valueless or even reactionary, actually help to make the conditions that we are both made the conditions of crony capitalism and made the conditions of activism. So it's a much more it's a way of thinking about people's practices, not as already either good or bad, right? But seeing how they become good or valuable and how they become bad. It is not to think from the outset that you can identify which experiences of people are politically wrong and which of them are politically progressive. That you have to see in the context how they contribute to the conditions that we live in, or how they can contribute to the transformation of our present conditions. So the argument in that chapter, which is about Lacapa's poems, is that adventurous practices contribute both to a system of social theft, which is crony capitalism, and contribute to activism in the first quarter storm. They contribute to this freeing of yourself into a movement to change history. And I can't give you a reading because I didn't bring that chapter here. No? I only brought the chapter on Ilinia Mabanglo. Ilinia Mabanglo, do you know who she is? She's a Filipina poet based in Hawaii. And she also writes about overseas contract workers. Right? Overseas contract workers are her subject, but what she sees in the overseas contract workers is not just, is a form of suffering, right? We see suffering as a bad thing, but what she portrays is that suffering is also the mode of possibility of them becoming domestic workers, and it is also a mode in which we might form a political community across boundaries. I don't know how much more I should read of this, because I really was planning to read some of these things, but they seem to me now to be very dense. Shall I just read a few things then, so you get the flavor of the thing? All right. Okay. There's a controversy about Mabanglo's poetry. On the one hand, some critics think that she is one of the only female modernists, right? Virgilio Almario proclaims her as an important poet and sees her importance as resting on the modernism, masculinist modernism that he extols. So he even said at one point that she wrote like a man, right? Feminists, on the other hand, criticize her because she's not feminist enough, right? She comes out as a feminist poet, but they think that she is too soft, too supplicating, right? That's not the ideal, as I said earlier, the ideal of feminism is the sovereign subject, in control, powerful, right? So in effect, the men and the women agree here that she is not masculine enough. Okay, in contrast to this, I understand the poetic agency of Mabanglo in terms of what she calls the suppleness of the tongue, lambot ng dila, as she says. Kung babaeng makatang nakapiit at salita ang kasangkapan ng tula, lalayang makata sa pamagitan ng wika. Ang bote ay nararapat maging bota, nararapat maging buto, nararapat maging bato. Okay? For those of you who don't know. If the woman poet is imprisoned and words are the utensils of poetry, the poet will be liberated through the use of language. The bottle, bote, should become a boot, bota, should become a seed or a bone, buto, should become a stone. So, this radicalizing movement and the transformation of matter, bote, bota, buto, bato, is enabled precisely by that softness of tongue that is the source and means of the female poet's power. We see the vowel changes in Mabanglo's example demonstrates a linguistic poetic agency that transforms through pliancy. We may say the agency of morphing, of transfiguring differentiation, rather than of radical opposition or resistance. Mabanglo's poetry engages in such subtle plays in morphemic and phonetic difference through infixing and suffixing, making change imminent in the very act of enunciation. For example, in the lines from her poem Mula sa Kuwait, Inako kay inang ang dingding na butas, ipinangako sa kapatid ang maningning na bukas. Or, to mother I promised to answer for the wall full of holes. To my siblings I promised a brilliant tomorrow. Here the phrase, ang dingding na butas, orally almost replicates ang maningning na bukas, but with slight consonant alterations that semantically convert material loss and lack into a temporal opening, meaning bukas. That alteration is repeated in the move from inako to ipinangako, from obligation to promise. By means of infixing, inserting additional syllables within orally similar lines, the supple and nimble tongue coaxes the promise of a radiant future out of a dire and heavy liability. Through this linguistic practice, Mabanglo performatively evokes the thematically suggested feeling of anticipation by increasing the rhythmic speed of the line. The imminence of change that the softness of tongue can produce is therefore not only in the content of the poetic statement, but also in the emotional and tonal effect of its utterance. It is with respect to this emotional power of poetic utterance that Mabanglo compares the female poet to the mythical female sorcerer. As she says, the female sorcerer has power in words, rewarding or punishing, glorifying or oppressing, lumuluwalhati o dumuduhati, caressing or flogging, humihimas o humahampas. The poet in turn has power in metaphor, weaving conundrums, stroking our hard inner beings until they soften, pacifying the whirlpools of our rage, obliterating even our hidden fears, and then bringing us closer to the heart of God. The supple tongue bears a practical, tangible, incantatory power, rather than being simply the means of representing the potency of power, as Mabanglo argues is the case with masculinist poetry. Word signs bear a quasi-physical agency vis-a-vis our sentient souls. Adept at wielding these word signs in the making of talinhaga, or metaphor, mystery, the supple tongue can utter the slight phonic alterations that will spell the difference between glorifying, lumuluwalhati, or oppressing, dumudahati, caressing, humihimas, or flogging, humahampas. The liberative agency of the female poet, then, is exercised not by destroying or escaping from the figurative bottle within which she is imprisoned, but by making it yield to the imminence of its radical transformation, bottle, boat, bone, stone. Freedom is not to be found outside of or in opposition to the symbolic order and means of her oppression, but in the exercise of a certain kind of pliancy or fluency. One might say a form of virtuosity that others might eschew. These poetic practices concord with, if not approximate, the very practices of self-making on the part of the diasporic Filipinas she writes about. In Mabanglo's poetry, we see the practices of accommodation, compliance, shrouding of wounds, remaking of self, self-denial, and denial of human need and loss that make up the living labor of subjective survival that helps to produce the